Hi, everyone. Hi, and welcome to Alta Live. My name is Beth Spotswood, and I am so excited to welcome you to today's very special Alta Live with San Francisco winemaker Christopher Renfro and Alta Journal contributor Sydney Love. My name is Beth Spotswood. Again, I'm the digital editor of Alta Journal. Today, we're going to be discussing the 280 project, founded in 2019 by Chris, and featured in Sydney Love's article in our latest issue. I so hope that you will check it out. It's about San Francisco's only urban vineyard and the incredible work that the 280 project is doing in the wine and agriculture industry in San Francisco. A bit about our guests before we begin. Chris, as I mentioned, founded San Francisco's only urban vineyard, the 280 Project. It's nestled among the 101 and 280 freeways, Alamany Apartments, Bayview, and Bernal Heights. So if you're familiar with San Francisco, there's this magical farm and vineyard nestled right in there. He is the vineyard manager of Alamany Farms and manages a paid viticulture apprenticeship program to teach BIPOC individuals about viticulture, connecting local communities to farming as a way to combat food insecurity, as well as viticulture education and field training to close the diversity and equity gap in the wine industry. Sydney is a wine writer based in LA. She's written for the San Francisco Chronicle, Wine and Spirits, The Wine Zine, and Pipette, as well as Alta Journal. If you're unfamiliar with Alta, a few words about us just before we begin. We are a quarterly magazine focused on California and the West. We present weekly events like this, as well as a monthly California book club. We've got this gorgeous magazine, including stories like the one we're about to talk about today. Our editor at large, Mary Melton, who will be conducting today's interview, helps edit this story. So she's going to kind of run today's interview and talk with Sydney and Chris about that. If you're interested in learning more about what we do at Alta, please visit us at altaonline.com. You can join us for as little as $3 a month, or give the gift of Alta to yourself or someone else for $50 a year. You'll get a hat, you'll get an upcoming California Book Club book. It's fabulous. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Please ask your questions for Chris and Sydney there. Mary will chat with our two guests for about 30 minutes, and then we'll get to as many of your questions as possible. If you're a regular here, you will know that we love for people to let us know where they're zooming in from in the chat. So with that, Mary Melton, I will toss it over to you.
Thank you so much, Beth. And Sydney, it's always great to see you. Thank you for being here. And Chris, so nice to meet you. I feel like I know you well from Sydney's beautiful writing about your amazing project. So thank you for joining us at Alta today.
Thank you.
I am going to start with you, Chris. Tell us, where are you right now?
So right now I'm in the Glen Park neighborhood of San Francisco. Can you guys hear me well?
We're hearing you.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I had Bluetooth headphone malfunction. But yeah, I'm in Glen Park, San Francisco. I'm currently at work selling wine, and yeah.
Yeah, so where are you in relation to Alamany Farms?
5 minutes away.
Okay, great.
So yeah, my job, my professional career is a wine buyer, and I am a wine buyer at Canyon Market here, but I also do farming as well in the community. So
great. And I want to start, because it kind of is at the root, no pun intended, of this story of the farm. Like, let's start with the farm. How did you discover it? How did you find it? And Beth gave us a little description of where it is located in San Francisco, but I think it comes as a big surprise even to people who live in San Francisco that there's a farm there. So how did you discover it?
yeah, so Alamany is a beautiful place. I used to see it driving by when I first moved to San Francisco 16 years ago, but it was called Slug back then, something League of Urban Gardeners, and yeah, it was that. But then a woman named Ellie Hemsworth actually planted the original vines on Alamany property. So she planted those vines. I went there to go look for a vine to see if I could either help her or take some cuttings to grow at my house. And that's how I found out about Alamany, the new version.
And what state was it in when you discovered it first?
It was pretty dilapidated, and they were actually in the process of ripping out vines. So they had about 120 to 30 vines, all Pinot, but it was reduced to about 65 vines by the time I got there.
Mm-hmm. And why were they ripping them out? Had they?
They had been abandoned. The person that had started the original project, actually, I think she either was just too overwhelmed, but wasn't really enjoying the engagement of the community around. She didn't really like the kids running through the vineyard, breaking the vines, she said, eating the fruit. So it was actually a perfect segue for us to come in and do the opposite thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that evolution. And Sydney, maybe you can chat a bit about that. Like, when did you first hear about the farm, and can you talk about how it has evolved under Chris's tutelage?
Yeah, so I believe Chris started farming the vineyard in December of 2019, and I heard about it the following summer in 2020. And at that point, we were in the middle of the pandemic and in quarantine. So I first learned about Chris on Instagram, actually. And at the time, I was working for Wine and Spirits magazine, and we were doing a feature called Rising Black Voices in Wine. And so in that project, we were highlighting 12 Black trailblazers in the industry, as well as 12 rising voices. And we decided to highlight Chris as a rising voice in the category of growing grapes and making wine. So I got to write about Chris at that point, just a very brief write-up on what he was doing. And this was before the apprenticeship program came into existence. So I've gotten to watch him over the past 2 years really bring this thing to life. And I wanted to write the story about it and how it came to be.
So we'll dig into the 280 project and what it is in just a second, Chris, but I'd love to chat a bit about your initial mission with the farms. We talk a lot, and you talk a lot in the story about food insecurities in the neighborhood, and as Sydney mentions, like, this is all kind of evolving, as the pandemic was, raging in San Francisco and California, and obviously everywhere. How did it? I know it will evolve into a 280 project story, but initially, like, what were your thoughts about what this new chapter meant for the farms and how it could serve a more rich purpose for the surrounding neighborhoods?
Yeah, so to explain it, they would, for all the viewers and listeners, Alamany Farm sits off the 280 freeway in San Francisco. It is on the backside of a neighborhood called Bernal Heights. Beautiful neighborhood, very affluent neighborhood. At the bottom of that neighborhood, there is another neighborhood called the Alamany Apartments. This is a lower income housing community, and it is pretty much attached to Alamany Farm. They actually share parts of land. So for me, once I was really on that land and I realized what was going on there and the proximity of poverty to privilege and wealth, it made me feel, it brought up a lot of feelings of what I was experiencing in the culinary industry and hospitality. I worked in fine dining at a few really reputable restaurants, one being Liho Liho. That's where I was an assistant wine director and ran the floor. But I was one of the only African-American people that I ever actually saw working there. And then as far as dining experiences, the only Black people that I had the opportunity of usually waiting on were NBA players, football players, musicians, actors, actresses. So the barrier of like entry was very high, and it didn't feel like a very safe space. I also actually had access to working special events, one in particular called Outstanding in the Field, which is all about farm to table cuisine. It's a term that's used in the food industry, farm to table. It seems like it makes sense. It's, you take the food from the farm, you put it directly on the table. That's as fresh as it gets. I didn't see that to really be true in the restaurant space. So when I got to this farm in the middle of San Francisco, I noticed there was an outdoor kitchen right in between the neighborhood that's lower income in this farm that has free food. So it just clicked immediately. I was like, wait, this is how we do something better than outstanding in the field. We do something completely that just actually is geared towards people that don't get to ever come into these experiences. So it made me think a lot about wine. It made me think a lot about fresh food, fine little small platings with tweezers and all that kind of stuff. And so I reached out to my friend Haley. I said, hey, can we do this? Within a week, we got together, and that's how we started that. And then, but yeah, the same thing when I saw the vines in Alameda, it's a no-brainer. I was like, wait, this has to be for the community rather than something that is actually still seeming like a privileged, very far thing to actually approach.
So describe to us, what is the 280 project and how that came out of your work at the farm?
Yeah, so 280 project, initially, my partner Janae and I, when we got the vines, we kind of were just stoked to be able to have this space for us to learn viticulture. But once Ahmaud Arbery had actually been murdered, you know what I mean? For me, that really hit, and I was just kind of lost on like, what do I do right now in this moment in our country? And then George Floyd happened, and I was like, oh my God, what do I do? So I was sitting there in the middle of the vineyard one day, and I was thinking about it, and I thought about the kids not being able to run through that vineyard and be respected or wanting to be there. And I also thought about the people that were also involved in planting those original vines, what they all looked like, who they were. And they were friends with this woman, and they weren't really multicultural. So it immediately clicked. I was like, Black kids need to run through these vines. Black kids need to learn viticulture. And also, what does the wine industry mean to me? What does fine dining mean to me? It doesn't feel like a safe space for a lot of people, especially Black, queer, Latin, non-binary, all of these different, even women, So I was like, these small vines, this little piece of area can actually be super powerful if we direct it, if we think community. If we rethink community, we can actually do this here right now in the middle of the city. So yeah, I was like, oh, we're off the 280. This is a project. This is something, a learning project. This is also right next to the projects, you know what I mean? The low income neighborhood. But it was like, wait, how do I learn how to grow grapes? How do I become more involved in the wine industry as a father who is struggling to make it in San Francisco? I know other people must be having these problems. So how can I create a way for us to open up the wine industry to actually allow access so people can see if they even want to be in this field? Because I see that the communities that I mentioned before are people that are missing out on the economic value of being winemakers or working within the beverage and food spaces. So 280 is a program that is fermentation, wine, viticultural school, but also a community space for people to actually be able to share their thoughts and be able to trust and grow together. So
that's great. Think about, this is the third story I think you've done now for Alta in the last 18 months that talks directly about the movements that have emerged within the wine industry to diversify the wine industry, and exactly in the ways in which Chris has outlined, and to make distribution and production open to a much wider swath of people. This feels like a pretty long overdue reckoning, but is there something specifically that you feel precipitated this?
I mean, truly, I think it was the pandemic. The world turned upside down and everything was suddenly under review. And people could no longer turn away. And we had to take a hard look at what was happening in the wine industry. And a lot of it was ugly. I mean, we have issues of racism, sexual violence, alcoholism, labor exploitation. And so I think a lot of how these movements came to be was these are direct responses to those issues. And I cover all of these things in my stories for Alta, going back to talking about LA's natural wine scene and how women had to create, their own spaces in the industry to then thrive in that. And then with Chris's story as well, And the first story I wrote was actually a direct response to the murder of George Floyd. I felt like that piece that I wrote about Simone Michelson was how I responded to what was happening and how I made sense of all of it.
And Simone, who called out the industry very specifically, right, in a letter
Exactly.
Let's talk, Chris, about the apprenticeship program. I'm so curious, since you've established it, both who's open to it, and what type of people have been applying to it in terms of demographics, age, where they're coming from, where they are in their life. Do you have to turn people away? I would imagine you do, because what you described sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, so the apprenticeship is basically like on the ground education. Like what we wanted it to be, like we said, it's the access. So being in wineries, being in vineyards, being around people that understand business, that understand the legality parts of wine. That was the main focus, was like, how do we do that? So I talked with fellow winemaker Steve Mathiasen and Beth Forrestrell, who is a UC Davis professor, and we sat together. And originally the idea was like, oh, let's go to 3 of the best vineyards, 3 of the best wineries, something like that, and just get as much information on how they got started, how they maintain their businesses and things like that, and potentially maybe there'll be a job opportunity. After sitting with Steve and Beth, we fleshed it out and we were like, oh, Steve has all the contacts that we need in viticulture. Beth has access to UC Davis winemaking facilities, but also vineyards that no one else has access unless you go to that school. So we combined forces, and yeah, I don't know, just the universe aligned, right? And the first group of people that we had as apprentices all seemed to come from somewhat of a like food background or wine background, except a few. One, Pascal, he was tech before he quit his job and fully threw himself into wine. He actually now lives in France, in the Loire Valley. But it was like we saw it immediately. Like the first day we were all at Linda Vista Vineyards, Steve Mathiasen's property, people were in tears. People were so thankful to see each other and feel like they could actually share their feelings and feel vulnerable. And that's where it started from. So we would meet every Friday from the beginning of the season for about 6 months. And the hours vary on different days, but it's literally hands-on training all the way from how a vine starts to the end of the season, to where those grapes end up becoming actual wine. And then in between that, we just try and facilitate the parts of like business and, like I said, law, but also ownership of land. And then it gets into hard questions of equity and race and the future of wine and climate and everything, because all of those things are wrapped in together. And it's been very interesting to see people applying from all over the world now. People have applied from all the way from India. And so sadly we have to turn people away, but with the right funding, with the right team that we're building, eventually, hopefully we'll be able to just be able to have space for everyone.
It's incredible. You obviously have written about and know a lot of these winemakers who Chris is referring to. And have you been surprised, like, at how enthusiastic it sounds like they've, welcomed this kind of input, and in some cases, I don't know if welcome is the right word, but really like been open to having these pretty, intense conversations?
Well, to start with, Steve and Beth, who partner with Chris to put on the apprenticeship program. I think if you know their backgrounds and what they've been involved with over their careers, these are very genuine people who do want to help and make a difference. And Steve Mathiasen is the authority on organic wine growing in Napa. And so in addition to running a winery and growing grapes, he's a consultant for a handful of other wineries in Napa. And so he has a lot of contacts. He knows everyone. And I think him and Beth essentially have been the keys to wine country for Chris and the 280 project. And I'm not surprised because I think, again, since 2020, a lot of wineries have been looking for ways to show their support for the movement. I think, again, some of it is genuine and some of it has been performative. But the apprentices have been able to visit all kinds of wineries through this program. I mean, they're doing this for 6 months and get to go visit someone new almost every week. So there's a wide range of people that they get to interact with. In the story, I mentioned Beckstoffer Tokelon Vineyard. And Beckstoffer Tokelon, if you are familiar with it, it's actually like probably the most famous site for Cabernet Sauvignon in Napa in California, possibly the country. And just for context, I worked for a cult Cabernet producer in 2018 called Paul Hobbs, and they make a Beckstoffer Tokelon wine. These grapes are really expensive. I mean, they're sold for $20,000 per ton minimum. And then these wineries that make this wine go for, $400 or more. So even though I got to help make this wine for this winery at Paul Hobbs, I couldn't afford to buy it or drink it or enjoy it myself. And yeah, so I'm not surprised, but I think it has created this conflict when these apprentices show up and suddenly they have access to this thing that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. And they're getting to see for the first time what's been withheld from them from this industry. And it creates a unique chance for these people to engage with one another and really talk about, what the issues are here.
Yeah, you talk a little bit about that in the story. And Chris, like, what types of tensions or topics have come up when you bring the apprentices together with the winemakers?
I mean, just it's everything. It's been the role of Psalms. It's been of sommeliers, sexual violence with sommeliers. It's been, how do we treat Latin workers? How do we treat migrant workers? Are we exploiting people still? Is there slavery in the fields? The discussion of how much a bottle of wine can actually be sold for if we take care of our employees. Those have been the arguments where certain winemakers have said and asked us as people of color sitting right in front of them, would you pay more money to make sure that people were taken care of? And it was a unanimous yes. And they said, well, you don't know what you're talking about. And I'm not going to say who specifically it was, but this is like what people refer to as the old guard, I guess, and some of the older generation. And I think they're waking up to the reality that people that are going to have the money are going to be young people and people that want to be cared for and want to be treated and respected well, so there really haven't been too many crazy interactions, because I think, like we said, once George Floyd, this thing happened, I think the doors were like just thrown open. So it's like, if you're trying to hide, it's a really hard thing to do because the questions are all now laid out. How much are you paying people? What do you do to make them feel included in your business? What is the access like? Is there upward mobility? You know what I mean? What do you actually want for your community? What are you doing to make your community better? So these are the questions that we ask. And a lot of the times it's not harmful. If anything, it's a good feeling. The things that have hurt me personally are, I've seen instances where white men control Latin men's voices when they speak specifically. Like I had the opportunity to speak to a master grafter, and the way that they kept cutting him off when I was asking him questions, that the other apprentices were able to actually take information and put into their notes, like how did he get his job? How did he start? What are the things that he works on? Like, what does he look for when he's in the field? Like, how is he such an expert? But it was those kind of things that made me realize it's like, oh, you still see him as yours,
Mm.
not him as himself, even though this man is flown around the world and, goes everywhere to go do this job. Someone also asked me once at a vineyard if I even understood what viticulture was, if I knew what viticulture was. And they said, I'm a viticulturalist. Do you understand what my job is? And I refrained and I didn't say anything, but it's like Steve Mathiasen brought us here. I don't think he picked us off the streets of San Francisco. And, so it's been weird stuff like that. But at the same time, it's the reality that people have been kind of kept away from each other and they don't know how to necessarily talk to each other with respect. So I feel very thankful that I get to be someone that gets to steward that.
Yeah, that's great. Sydney, where do you see this movement as a reporter on this, who's pretty embedded in all of this? Where do you see this all heading? What excites you on the horizon, other than the work that Chris is doing, obviously?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I see BIPOC and people of color self-organizing and creating their own spaces in the industry. So there are so many organizations out there now, in addition to what Chris is doing. There's Black Wine Professionals, the Roots Fund, the Veration Project, Hispanics in Wine, and these all came from the pandemic. These were all founded in 2020. And there's another organization called the Association of African American Vintners, and they've been around for 2 decades, but since 2020, their membership has grown by 500%. So I see the industry becoming more diverse and more inclusive because people of color are making pathways for themselves.
It's great. And for anyone who's watching, we'll include links to all those organizations that Sydney mentioned in a follow-up email after this. So don't worry if you didn't jot all those down. Chris, can we just talk before we bring Beth back on? A couple more quick questions. One, let's just talk a little bit about the wines. Like, what are you growing? What are you cultivating?
So Pinot. I'm growing Pinot, and that's
Is it strictly Pinot?
Pinot Noir. So growing Pinot Noir in San Francisco, but also growing Terral de Go, Claret, growing some Gamay, a little bit Frankish, but then hybrids. I'm growing hybrids that I was gifted from a winemaker named Matt Neese, North American Press. He's kind of like my mentor on the hybrids. And then I'm also growing hybrids down in a place called Woodside, a very special place called Filoli Gardens. It's a garden land trust, and it's a special place because it's where I would go to for field trips when I was in school for horticulture 12 years ago. And full circle moment, I'm now growing the grapes on this property, which are in a secret location and only open to the public during orchard days in the fall. So it's about 127 different vines. I think maybe 4 of them are table grapes. The rest are all hybrids. So it's a very special place in California. Just for the listeners, hybrid grapes are bred in school, universities, places by botanists so they can be pest resistant, drought resistant, cold hardy. And this is kind of the future we're going towards. We want less spraying, less inputs, less chemical use. We want less water used. And yeah, it's also a different expression of wine. So I feel very lucky to be able to be in this arena right now. And yeah, it kind of just fell in my lap, but all of it seems like it's fate. So,
yes.
And then I experiment a lot. I just make a lot of weird stuff.
Yeah. And Sydney, you've tried some wines here. So like, what do you think?
Yeah, I've tried the rosé from Filoli, and it's a blend of all those grapes. So they just combined all of them. And it's, a rosé blend of 100 different hybrid grape varieties from this single site. I also got to try the wine that they made in partnership with UC Davis. So they made a red blend from wild grape species native to North America. And so most of the wines that we're familiar with as consumers are made from Vitis vinifera, which are, native to Europe or Asia or other parts of the world. So to be having these wines, I mean, they don't really fit in with what we're used to, and they do taste differently. And so I'm really excited about these ones because I think they tell a story from the grapes that they're made with, from the hands that make them, to how they taste. And there's only a handful of Black winemakers who are making wines naturally. So I believe Chris's wines have no additives, no sulfur, none of that. And yeah, it's really, really exciting. And I hope that more Black winemakers can be doing this kind of work.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think I revealed maybe on a previous Alta Live with Sydney, Chris, that Gamay is my favorite wine. So I got my eye on your Gamay grapes. I'm excited to try it. I'd love to my last question for you, Chris, before we bring Beth on, is you've had a pretty remarkable life. You've worked in design, and you've worked obviously in the food industry and amidst nature and for social justice reform. And you seem like someone who's really looked for and found real meaning in your work. And this is such a time for so many people to reflect on what they're doing and what they're not doing with their lives, I think, over the last couple of years. Do you have any words of advice or inspiration for anyone who may be reconsidering right now how to do something more meaningful with their future?
Yeah, totally. I think it all comes down to happiness, and if you can make other people around you happy as well as yourself, I think that's a good start. And really listening to how you feel, really checking in with what excites you and what makes you feel like you're impacting the world in the way that you want to. And I actually had a really beautiful conversation with a friend last night where these things keep hitting me. I've been thinking about this lately, about time and success. And for me, as someone who looks into, wellness books and all these things and success books, success has started to mean to me more about how I use my time and how I'm intentional with my time. So I think being able to measure my success is measuring how well I use my time and what I'm doing with it. And then for anyone, I had this analogy pop into my head last night where I thought about if you were born and you were told to only have so much blood in your body, how well you would protect it. And I think time is the same way. If you realize that you only have so much time and you don't want to lose it, you should wake up every day being very intentional with how you use this gift given to you. So it's like you wouldn't want to bleed out and waste it and be done. So don't do the same thing with your days.
That's great. That's really great advice. Thank you for that. We'll invite Beth back on. There's a book I read, 4,000 Weeks, which speaks a lot to what you're talking about, which I'd recommend to folks, by Oliver Burkeman. But when you put it all in perspective, we've basically got 4,000 weeks on average on the planet, and that's not a lot. Thank you for sharing that, Chris. All right, Beth.
Quick reminder before a couple of questions from our audience. This interview has been recorded. Don't worry, we will email it to everyone who's registered for this event. Our wonderful assistant editor, Jess Blau, is taking copious notes, and we'll send you links to everything that Chris, Sydney, and Mary talked about. And questions for you, Chris. One from Louise Farr, an Alta Journal contributor. What are you anticipating in terms of taste and quality from Marquette, Kashu, and Semillon vines? I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Forgive me.
Yeah, so I'll start with Koshu. Koshu is definitely the one that I'm probably most interested in. It's how I feel like I got to UC Davis in the first place. Beth finding out that I was interested in this grape. It's a grape variety from Japan. So it's beautiful. Everybody should go look it up. It's Koshu, and they're these beautiful pink orbs of grapes, and the way that they're farmed looks so delicate, and they're even wrapped in these tiny little paper bags and stuff. And but I'm excited to see Koshu. Simeon, I've already tasted before. It's a delicious, weighty white grape. I feel like it would be fun for sparkling. And then Marquette is awesome. It's one of those hybrids that can be grown in very cold climates. And I think carbonic Marquette is going to be very delicious. I feel like I actually tasted a Marquette recently from Iapetus, and I remembered it being way more almost like Gamay-like or Cab Franc-like. And when I tasted it again, it was way more serious. It had a lot of structure. And yeah, I kind of want to see Marquette made in a super light style, possibly even Marquette Rosé or something. But yeah, I love those three grapes.
Last question. Where do you sell? Where can we purchase 280 Project wines? In San Francisco, or, oh, I actually have another great question. Okay, but where can we get 280 Project wines?
Yeah, so 280 Project wines are going to be coming through North American Press again for the rosé this year. We made more quantities, so that'll be happening. If people ever want to tap into me just on the Instagram, I give bottles away also from the stuff that I make at home that's not licensed. So I just want people to taste, and it's not even about sales at this point. I am like fundraising to try and get all of it done legit, so we can find a winery, so we can be able to grow grapes, purchase grapes, and trust me, when it's ready, you're all gonna know. So just be ready.
Got it. And finally, oh, how can we support? I know Giving Tuesday just passed. Is there a way to support 280 projects? Can people donate?
Yeah, totally. So we have a website, 280project.com. We're fundraising all the time. I think that's what I need support in, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and be open about that. I am not the best person at fundraising. I would love people to help me figure out how we can solidify real funds so we can make this a forever program. I want to be able to eventually, you know, leave my wine buying job and actually become a sales person of happiness and viticulture instead. So yeah, we have goals of trying to make this an abroad program as well. And just honestly, 280 is a like a knowledge sharing kind of platform. So yeah, you can donate on the website. And if you know organizations that want to maybe book me for public speaking or things like that, yeah, reach out to 280project.com. Our email's there. And if you feel like there's a way that you can help, I'm open to any support.
Last question. How can someone apply to an apprenticeship? What's the process like? Are you currently accepting?
Yeah, we'll be opening the apprenticeship back up probably here in the next month or so. And I will go ahead and make sure that everything is posted online. Everything will be posted online, and we will, yeah, the applications go pretty fast. So like I said, it's limited availability, and that's all due to funding. So we will have about 5 to 10 spots depending on fundraising. And yeah, once those applications come open, we go through, we check and make sure, seeing what everybody's interests are and how we can, I think it's more about seeing like, how can we actually help people get where they want to be? So yeah, start thinking about that. Start thinking about where you want to be in the wine industry, what you want to be doing.
Chris, Sydney, and Mary, thank you all so very much. Folks, before you leave, check your email later this afternoon. We will send you a link to this interview, as well as the 280project.com. I link to it here, articles, organizations that Chris and Sydney mentioned. Join us next week, where our newsletter editor, Matt Haber, will be in conversation with the editors of The Believer magazine. It's making its return to the magazine world thanks to a crowdfunding campaign. So join us for that. We'll send you a link to that as well. Again, thank you all so much for joining us today and taking the time, especially to you, Chris, for stopping everything to head out to the sidewalk and do this interview with us. We're so very grateful. So thank you so much all, and take care.
Thank you.